Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar of the Sustainable Cities course. So this week we are joined by Gautam Bhan, and we'll be listening and interacting. Gautam is the lead of academics and research at in the Institute of for Human Settlements, and Gautam works on the politics of poverty, inequality, development in Indian cities with a focus on housing, social security, governance, and urban and planning theory. He co-anchors ongoing research at IHS on reframing urban inclusion. He co-authored Swept Off the Map, Surviving Eviction and Resettlement in Delhi, as well as several journal articles. Gautam has extensive experience in advising public institutions, including providing inputs to the Rajiv Awas Yojana and the New Delhi Municipal Act. He's an active part of urban social movements, as well as a frequent columnist and writer in diverse media. So we'll start this webinar by listening to Gautam, who will let us know about his experience, his work, his research, and other experiences for about 10 minutes. And then in the meanwhile, please write in your thoughts, comments, and questions in the chat box. And also please remember to provide as much context as possible, but also keep the questions concise. So over to you, Gautam.
Thanks. So welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening, or good night, wherever you are. I'm speaking to you from my home in Delhi. So my apologies if at any point, it is late in the evening here. So my apologies if at any point some part of my home life disrupts our webinar, but that would be quite apt on a session on housing. So I thought I'd just put out, many of you will have seen my lecture in the course itself on housing. But for those of you who have not, I thought I'll just reiterate some core elements of our approach here at IHS on housing. So IHS is a new institute of higher education focused on looking at the possibilities and as well as the challenges of managing India's urbanization. But theoretically and conceptually, it is very committed, particularly to looking at urbanization and urban and planning practice and theory from the perspective of the Global South. Now, I think this is something that we have thought a lot about in many ways. And so a lot of what I'm going to say today is going to be particularly suited to thinking about questions of housing in Southern urbanism. But I want to reiterate that by no means does that imply that it is only relevant to cities in the Global South. I think one of the profound shifts in planning and urban thought over the last 10 years has been to say that there is something that all cities, no matter where they are in the world, have to learn from the experience of southern cities. But that southern cities have not yet been allowed to offer the kind of insights they have to questions of planning and theory, as well as particularly questions to housing, than to think about them. Our traditional ideas have been that ideas in the global north will be used in some way to do development or be applied in the global south. But I think that is welcome shift in both directions, with the north and the south learning from each other and the south learning from other places in the south. So when we apply this to housing, what are some of the things that it makes us think about? Let me give you one very specific empirical statistical example. In my city, in Delhi, most of the housing is built in a very particular way. When we think of housing, we often think of a house. We think of a completed unit. It has a material form, it has a size, it has a structural form, it has 4 walls, it has a roof, it's made of good materials, it has a tap and a drain and a toilet. And we, many of us, by we I mean a set of folks who particularly don't belong to working poor and working class communities, we move into a house when all of this is complete. To us, the house is a unit. But for most residents of Delhi, housing is not a house. It is not a unit. It is actually a process. What do I mean by that? What I mean by it is that for most residents of cities of the South, they build their homes incrementally while they live in them. This process has been called auto-construction in Latin America. Very commonly, it's called incremental housing, self-built housing. There's work on this from the 70s, John Turner's work about housing as a verb and a process, not as a noun or a thing. And I think when we start thinking about housing as a process, as a part of life, as opposed to an infrastructural material unit of a house or a dwelling unit, That shift from a house to housing really opens up many ways for us to think better about sustainable development, especially the SDGs, and that paradigm in application to housing. Because when you're building your house incrementally over time, and the second aspect of that process is very often it is done in some form of what Brazilian anthropologist Teresa Caldeira would call tension, not violation, but tension with formal law, with formal planning, with formal definitions of property. So it could be an informal settlement built on municipal land. It could be a formal house built on rural land or peri-urban land, built with irregular subdivision. So there are degrees of tension with formal logics of law and planning, none of which are cleanly legal or cleanly legal in a simple way. And so then housing becomes both a political process defined by this tension. It also becomes an incremental process that happens over time. And one of the big challenges for us who think about sustainable development, to think about housing policy, is what changes about housing policy and practice when you're responding to an incremental process versus the delivery of single completed units? What happens when you have to say that the fundamental question in dealing with housing is not of material quality of wall, quality of roof, size of unit, but security of tenure, legality of settlement, claims to property and claims to property rights of different kinds? This changes the debate about housing very much. So at IHS, we have really been grappling with how to think about reaching the sustainable development goal of inclusive and accessible housing that reflects the reality of currently existing housing in cities of the South and doesn't actually begin from almost like as if we had a terra nullis, right? A clean slate from which to deliver. So there is both then a framework in IHS that says to address housing and the housing challenges of cities in India and in the South, one has to both work with the building of new housing. It's necessary. Cities will grow, they will expand, there will be migration. Children will have different demands from their parents, families will expand, aspirations will change, incomes will change. But at the same time, you have to improve existing but inadequate housing. And this joint approach of improvement of what's there and the construction of what must be built, what balance between improvement and construction becomes the question. And in different parts of the global South, this balance is different, right? So in Latin America, consolidation and not construction happened through the 70s and 80s, and there's a lot more focus on new housing building. In India and in many cities in Africa, that consolidation is yet to happen. So with these variations, so the first point I want to say that in our work, in our approach to housing, is to really think about this balance between improvement, which is often called upgrading or retrofitting, and I'll talk a little bit about these, versus the building of new units, which can very often, housing policy can get very reduced to, I need to build 100,000 units, 30 square meters each. And that's something that at IHS, we position ourselves against. So the framework that we work on, and I'll end with this, is the idea that housing, when distinguished from houses on only the materiality of the unit, has three main components. The first, of course, is its affordability, which is both the cost of the house and access of finance to reach that. The second is its adequacy, which is the dwelling unit itself, the house, but also access to basic services and infrastructure, as well as security of tenure, which can be as simple as a freedom from eviction, but as concrete as a full exchangeable market recognized title. And that spectrum of property rights is something we can talk about if you want. And it's very important that the adequacy condition is an and condition. So it is an adequate dwelling unit and adequate services and adequate security of tenure. It can't be one of the three. So you can have a very nicely built house with services and infrastructure, but it may not have formal title or legal title. That's not, for us, adequate housing. And the final part of the triad then is viability. And viability is when housing connects to other urban systems. So one of the classic things that we learn working in Indian cities is that most low-income households, all of us, but particularly low-income households, make choices about housing on the basis of employment. People come to cities for work. They don't come to cities for better quality housing, which means they will often make choices to be closer to work in lesser adequate or physically inadequate housing than to choose better material quality housing at the edge of the city. And this is a big challenge for cities of the South because a lot of low-income new housing is precisely built 20, 30 kilometers away from work. It's built in the periphery of cities. And then we constantly see that those houses are not occupied or not meaningfully occupied by intended residents. But that's precisely because that housing breaks the viability of making livelihood and cultural belonging work in those peripheral locations. So if we're able to improve the adequacy and affordability of housing, but only do it at the edge of our cities, we're not going to solve our housing problem. So therefore, the connections that we're looking at are for housing to be a combination of affordability, adequacy, and viability. And it's only when all three come together that you can actually have an approach to housing that fits with the intersectional approach of the SDGs themselves. So let me stop there and say that I'm happy to take questions on any parts of this framework, on our experiences on housing across the South, to hear from your experiences of housing where you are, whether it's in the South or the North, and then to think about some of the tensions. There are no easy answers here. A lot of this is actually about balance and trade-offs. And I want to emphasize this idea of trade-offs, because I think too often in policy work, and especially when we have multiple goals to reach, not just one. The SDGs aren't a single goal, they're a set of goals. Often those goals pull against each other in ways that we don't quite recognize. So one of my critiques of the Sustainable Development Goals has always been that it doesn't tell us how to prioritize, and it doesn't tell us what it means that progress in one goal could come at the expense of slower progress towards the other. How do we make these navigations? Who gets to make these trade-offs? So we can discuss all of those things in the next 40, 50 minutes, and it'll be good. So I see a question here, the first one, which is, would you know of any other successful stories where governments have taken different approaches to reduce poverty? So I think there are some very good housing initiatives that we should be learning from. So the first one that, let me put out an example that I think is a very good one, is the initiative by the government in Thailand. Now, in Thailand, one of the largest housing programs was called Ban Mangkong. Ban means house in Thai, and Mangkong means secure. And Ban Mangkong worked precisely on a large national program. It started at city level, but scaled up to the national level. And it focused on what they called in situ upgrading, which is in situ means in place, and upgrading means an approach to improve existing housing, not build new housing units. So this is the first approach I was talking about. And they did this at scale. And what they were able to do is to begin by improving settlement level infrastructure services. That slowly led to the improvement of houses. And within a period of 5 to 7 years, and this is important because in incremental improvement, you don't see dramatic transformations as quickly as when you build new houses. Now, as all of us know, in political cycles, election cycles, this matters. Upgradation is cheaper, it's easier to do at scale, and it works with what people have already built. But it takes longer. You will have to have the patience for results to show. It can't be instantaneous, so it's not as spectacular. And that makes its political management quite difficult. In Ban Mangkong, the advantage they also had is that they combined the infrastructure improvements of the material condition of houses with negotiations for secure tenure. Now, many of these were informal settlements that were built on occupied public land. And what the government did is they negotiated for different kinds of tenure arrangements. So sometimes in locations, they were only able to get short-term licenses for permission to use land. They took those. But a majority of them were what were called cooperative long-term leaseholds, 30-year, 60-year, 90-year leaseholds that were given not just to individual households, but to collective communities. And that was partly also to safeguard too quick a gentrification of these spaces. So I would encourage you very much to see the Ban Mangkong example. And I think that it's one of the examples I know where in situ upgrading has worked at scale, moving up. Now it covers 44 cities in Thailand and has covered over almost 150,000 households in Bangkok alone. The second example I think that's important is to see the Latin American experience of upgradation in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Brazil, variously called favela barrio, for example. In Venezuela, but also in Brazil, the example of protecting favelas using a new zoning category called the Zones of Special Social Importance. In Portuguese, the abbreviation is ZEIS. And what those did is that they marked existing favelas in order for service upgradation and improvement. There are critiques of all these schemes, and I'm not suggesting any of them is a silver bullet, but I'm also suggesting to you that those bullets don't exist. But each of these programs were large-scaled, driven by governments, focused on improvement. For success in mass-scale building of new housing, I would look at the South African case, which has managed to build 1.2 million new units. The South African case's history is much more contested, however, because many folks also argue that the insistence on providing single-family units has meant that the sprawl of cities has grown, which has deep sustainability and ecological consequences. It's not made any impact on the transit times for working folks in South African cities. And the history of apartheid in South African cities means that anyway, these are deeply segregated cities with strong distances between communities, and new housing has worsened many of these distinctions. But at the same time, it has made many South African citizens homeowners and given them access to safe and adequate housing. And that balance, again, becomes about the question. But South Africa is also realizing that it cannot keep up with the kind of demand. So the question, again, of balancing new house construction with improvement comes back. So that's a range of examples from different parts of the world that you can think about. Let me give you one last example from the global north. I think Spain has been exemplary for a long time in using inclusionary zoning that mandates that private or public real estate developments must reserve 50% of their units for low-income housing. Which is both intending to create mixed income neighborhoods, but also ensure the construction of low-income housing stock in what are largely real estate-driven markets as opposed to state-structured markets. And I think Spain has really shown the importance of being able to regulate the private market towards low-income housing in cities of the north. And I think Berlin is the other good northern example, where the city has experimented both with rent caps in certain neighborhoods to keep affordability, but has also deeply used mandatory regulatory enforcements on private developers to reserve housing for low-income communities. And I think they've had success in increasing the production. So there's a range of examples on that.
Yeah, thanks for that extensive answer, Gautam. We already covered the global north, in terms of Spain and Berlin, but we also have somebody asking us about what can be done to make housing affordable in a city like London. It's a very London-specific question, so if you could elaborate on that.
Absolutely. So I think London is a very interesting case right now. So I completely agree. I just actually I came from London 3 hours ago on this flight. So I have been thinking a lot about and had a chance to think a lot about the changes in the housing scenario there. I think that London has 2 or 3 interesting challenges. One is that it has several lock-ins in its real estate market, because like a lot of multinational global cities in the north, a lot of its real estate is owned not just by domestic capital, but by foreign capital. This makes interventions in the real estate market quite difficult in some parts of the city. But at the same time, London does have a history of publicly built council housing stock. Now, this is a history that has been in the last 20 years under grave threat through deregulation, through selling off that stock, and that's really breaking some of the integration in London about the fact of having viable and affordably, not just affordable, but well-located low-income housing. I think that the authority in London seems to me at this moment to be politically much more committed to taking more radical action. So what I've heard being discussed are, for example, learning from the Brazilian example about taxing vacant properties at prevailing market rental rates to try and get unused housing stock back in to the system. London still has a lot of public land that they're trying to open up and free up. I think it has the advantage of having a very strong transit system that allows a certain amount of distancing to still be viable. And I think they're leveraging that in many kinds of ways. I think that in many ways, the question that London has to ask is, how far is it willing to go to regulate and restrict the upper end of the private real estate housing market? Because I think that many northern cities are realizing that if they do not restrict that higher end capital, they're not able to hold speculation. So the question that's being asking about a large number of vacant homes. Vacancy is a problem from Egypt to India to London. But the causes and structure of that vacancy in the London market are very different, because their vacancies are typically at the highest ends of the housing market, and they're part of the speculative nature of foreign real estate and multinational capital. So I think that in many ways, London needs to really be able to structurally think about real estate market regulation. And that requires a certain political climate where that argument can be made. And I think that in some ways, the current climate in London is much more amenable to it than it was, I would say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, where London was really competing with other global cities for real estate capital. And I think it has reversed some of its positions on that. The advantage London has is that its city government is powerful, which means it has the regulatory and policy authority, jurisdiction, and instruments to do this regulation, should it choose to. It also has the ability to use a lot of market-based funding mechanisms, learning from some experiences of the San Francisco and Los Angeles Bay Area, for example, that have used transfer vouchers and rent subsidy vouchers to be able to intentionally mix neighborhoods. What London, to me, has not done enough of is to learn from Spain. Is to learn from Spain and Berlin about mandatory reservations of mixed affordable housing. London has them, but it does not have them nearly at that scale. It's not a commitment in a way at a city level to say you're not going to be able to get the gains of real estate without giving back affordable housing stock to the city. And I think Berlin and Barcelona are excellent models of economically competitive and viable northern cities that are still able to play that regulation. And I think that's where, if I was in London, that's where I would push.
Okay, thanks for that, Gautam. The question trail seems to be following you from London to Delhi. We have a question from Baishali Lahiri, who asked that in Delhi, there are several unauthorized colonies without basic services, housing middle-class income households, and yield huge money to landowners. How does it further complicate sustainable planning? That's the question.
I mean, so this is the classic challenge of auto-constructed cities in the South, right? So the unauthorized colony is a classic symbol of what happens when planning has to catch up with the city as opposed to directing the city. So the unauthorized colony is built in a way, for those of you not familiar with India, is typically built on, it is legally bought land. This is not squatting. It's not the same thing as the informal settlement or what we call the basti, erroneously in English called the slum in India, in northern India, in Hindi-speaking India. But it is typically a unauthorized conversion of what is likely rural land or unzoned urban land or forest land zoned in the green belt. So it's land that is not authorized for urban use, which is why the word unauthorized comes from there. It's very common in cities of the South. It's very common on the edges of expanding cities. And what it does for us to complicate sustainable planning is that it takes away your ability to control the expansion of urban boundaries. Because by the time you get the plan out to peri-urban areas and say, look, I want to do a green belt here or a marshland here, or protect this for affordable housing, or build an affordable housing zone or a transit-oriented development zone, that area is already built up. Unlike what your plan says, which is that you should be able to put a zone on it. Now, politically, this becomes very difficult because in one way you can say this is a blatant violation of the law, and it is. But the fact is it's still human-built housing. And therefore, it is impossible in one way. When it happens, if a few people violate a law, you can act against them. If many people violate a law, then there's something about the law that's not working. And it makes retrospective action very difficult. So typically what democratic governments end up doing, but all governments end up doing, is doing what we call a post facto regularization, which basically means that after the fact, you say, you shouldn't have built this here, but now that you built this here, I will regularize you. Now, in some ways, we have no options to fight against this because the other option is mass-scale demolitions, which have their own human development consequences. And so we're really stuck in a hard place once these things are built. But what it complicates really for us is imaginations of future planning that are based on directing how cities should grow and forcing us constantly to respond to how cities have already grown. And it also means, for example, you have a whole set in Delhi, in East Delhi, in the unauthorized colonies, you have a whole set of colonies that have been built. They may be middle class, but there are no underground drains under them. There are no sewage networks under them. That's because they were built before the planned expansion, so the trunk infrastructure was not laid out. So I think that in many ways, we have to be able to say, we have to start working with the mix of changing in the southern city. We have to change our imagination of the techniques and practices of planning to really say, what does retrofit planning look like? What does post-facto planning look like? Because we will need one generation of catch-up before we're able to really return to a more future-oriented question of planning. So the unauthorized colony is definitely, it's a symptom and a problem, but we've got to take it pragmatically and start working with what's there and start getting infrastructure into these settlements and then really asking ourselves, how do we then protect the next generation of expansion? What can we do to practically think about protecting our peri-urban areas as our cities expand even further?
Hey. Next, we have a three-part question, Gautam. So Anant Krishnan asks, how do you decide tenure in housing, which is vital, but could cause a distortion when speculation governs the value? Would it incentivize transfer of welfare housing? And what model of welfare works in this situation?
Yeah, this is a very important question. And it's one that there's no simple answer for. So let me give you the different sides of the debate and the positions. So one argument is, if you intervene in insecure housing and you want to give tenure, the Hernando de Soto argument, which was very popular for some time, is a Peruvian economist, I think, was the argument that we must give the poor title to the land under their feet. So it would unlock housing as an economic asset, allow them to raise capital, allow them to sell and exchange. Now, in some ways, I can see the logic of this, right? The danger here, of course, is that once you take land that has remained unaffordable, precisely because it is not fully legal, right? So this is not the London experience. In London, you have legal property that has to regulate real estate market to drive down price. Here, we're talking about property that is affordable precisely because you cannot buy and sell it on the open market, so that it does not actually have its full real estate value, right? So actually, this is housing where the use value of housing is more dominant than the exchange value of housing. Now, the issue is, as you secure tenure more, you start moving closer to the exchange value of housing. Now, many folks argue that poor households have as much of a right to play the real estate market as rich households, that it is actually unethical to not give full property rights to the poor and let them make decisions on when they want to sell and what they want to do with that capital. And I see the merits of that argument. And many poor households absolutely make this argument that their property rights should not be restricted in any way. I think the counter argument, however, is that when you are in a deeply unequal housing market, which means that the barrier to entry to minimal legal housing is very high, and this is true of Delhi. So a typical urban poor household in Delhi could work 3 lifetimes and still not ever make enough money to buy a formal legal house in our real estate market. That's how broken the skew is. And what that means is that even if you sell your house, you are never going to get enough money to enter into the legal housing market yourself, which means that as housing policy, that gentrification is a problem in 2 ways. One is that your problem of inadequate housing doesn't go down because people sell their house and go back to informal and inadequate housing. If they were selling their house and going into legal formal housing, then it would work. Then I think the challenges to title are not actually so much of a problem. So the question is not so much, should we give full title or other forms of tenure? What is more welfare enhancing? It depends on the structure of your housing market. If you are in a housing market where that sale of title is unable to secure a re-entry into the adequate formal housing market, then titling is more distorting of welfare than generative. If you're in a housing market where you can rent or own legally into better housing, then titling can be welfare enhancing. Thailand, I told you, took a clear stand against individual titles because it precisely believed that if it gave individual titles too quickly, then the pressure to sell would actually be so strong that while those physical neighborhoods would improve, those households would get displaced from them. And this is what they called market-induced displacement, as distinct from eviction or demolition-led displacement. So I think that the question depends on the structure of the housing market. And I think that, so I would say 2 things from my personal position. I think that the needs and aspirations of communities are one of the primary determinants of this. Many communities want titles, and that is what they struggle for. They have every right to do so, and a right to take a certain set of risks. I think the structure of the housing market determines this. But I think that what's very important is that we recognize the spectrum of property rights. Every addition to property rights is welfare enhancing. which means if you move to a no eviction guarantee, you have enhanced welfare. You move to a leasehold, you have enhanced welfare. You move to title, you have enhanced welfare. So the balance we have to say is we must move on the property rights ladder. But the pace of that movement must be one that can take people along. And I think this is where the remembering that housing is built incrementally, also because wages of poor households grow incrementally. If your house changes faster than your economic status changes, then typically that house improves without you, right? Because you're not able to afford to stay in that house. So I think that the question we really have to ask is, how do we correctly measure the risks that come with increased property title and incorporation into the market? And how do we measure it against the consequences of incorporation into the market? I think the parallel I would use from here is microfinance. I think microfinance really understood this. So many microfinance programs do not give loans to the poorest households, they give grants. And the reason they do that is they say your ability to take risk of any kind, in that case it's financial risk, has to grow over time. So just access to affordable finance is not good in itself unless you have the ability to manage the risk of what will happen if your entry into the market results in failure. And I think that's why what they argue is that the poorest households need grants and support to first get to an economic status where they can afford to take a risk in the housing market. I think that parallel holds very true of housing. I think when you have deeply unequal housing markets, my personal position is to be wary of titles and to be wary of market-induced displacement very strongly. And I think the more equitable your housing market becomes, the better chance you have to think of those. But I will say that my own thinking on this has been challenged in many ways because this is one type of logic. The other type of logic is what communities who have built their homes think they deserve. And they are the only people who can decide what they think they deserve. And so if politically the demand is for titles, that is also them saying that this is the risk we are willing to take. And that's also a reality that we have to live with as people not in those homes themselves.
Okay, Sampath Reddy speaks for all of the middle class in India when he asks, can we ease permits to build extra rooms on a house in urban areas? We have to either pay a bribe or be legal. Could you talk about regulations, permits, and how we navigate?
No, I think you're absolutely right. This is not just an India-specific question. I think the question of the appropriate, so these are all what are called, planners call these development control norms or building bylaws. And there are two sets that control how much you can build, to what extent, and when. I think the good thing about working with the paradigm of incremental housing is that it doesn't just apply to the informal settlement. It absolutely applies to middle class housing. I think many kinds of households extend slowly and over time. I think there are two considerations. So if you're a building bylaw maker or planner, what are you thinking? You're balancing questions of structure and safety and hygiene, questions of light, air, and ventilation. That's the basis of building bylaws, right? So those are the questions that we have to think about on the counter side. But I think that we have, in India particularly, our problem partly is not so much that we don't believe that people should enhance their rooms and incrementally improve them. Our problem is that our building bylaws are completely non-dynamic. They're not located in particular places. So for example, every geoclimatic zone builds with different materials, and our bylaws don't recognize that difference. The spatial requirements of a low-income family that has a bicycle is very different from a middle-income family that has a scooter, different from that family grows wider and gets a car. Yet our bylaws do not distinguish between parking space setbacks for low-income and upper-income households, which is ridiculous because you'd actually take away productive space from low-income households for shelter or for work. The third thing is that we have in many Indian cities, though this is getting much better, still a reluctance about mixed use as a mode of planning that allows households to combine economic activity, reasonable economic activity, with residence. And again, this is key for low-income households. I think that there is certainly a question of how to make our bylaws more dynamic and responsive. And to me, I would highly endorse this, because any bylaws that reasonably and safely allow the incremental expansion of houses through expansion and small repair, they can address congestion, they can address increasing family size, they can open up rental, they can open up economic opportunities, many things can happen. So I agree with you that this is a push we have to do. I think that this is different. However, I also see you talk about FSI, and I do want to distinguish this very much. So FSI is what in India is called floor space index, or in other parts of the world is often called floor area ratio, FAR. Basically, building code norms on how much you can build on a plot. So it controls heights, it controls square foot of built space as a ratio of the plot. And I think that the problem in India is that we have started treating FSI as a way to regulate the building of space disconnected with its spatial footprint. So in Bombay, for example, you can buy FSI, you can trade FSI. And this idea of trading FSI is not in principle a bad thing. I think it can be quite logical. But what it has resulted in is that FSI gets bought and sold almost like carbon credits for the environment, without a relationship to its geography. So there is a reason why you don't build in certain heights on certain road widths, because those FSI are calculated on the basis of traffic and of infrastructure footprints. And increasingly, what you're beginning to see is if you want to mine in the Brazilian Amazon and just buy carbon credits and then build forests in Indonesia to compensate for them, that acts as if those acts are spatially neutral. They're not spatially neutral. FSI is not spatially neutral. And so what you get is a very odd, it is to take on the early question that Baishali asked, the turning FSI into a fiscal instrument as opposed to a spatial instrument has led to deep distortions in our planning. And you suddenly start getting densities that you can't sustain. And then we don't understand why our traffic blocks itself in certain ways. But that's partly because we have taken a spatial planning instrument and turned it into an economic trade instrument. And there is a deep danger in this. There is a reason why, to go back to the London question earlier, London could play with FSI exactly this way to solve some of its problems, but it doesn't do it for exactly this reason. It's because you can't delink it from that particular spatiality.
So we have another question from Sheetal Patil, and she asks, do you think the ecological soundness can be maintained in the urban housing scheme that India has introduced? If it doesn't, then there's a clear conflict between SDGs, and then in that case, what's the way out?
I have been on record on this with the government, so I have no hesitation in saying this. I think that the current Indian housing scheme, which is the Housing for All by 2022, its acronym is PMAY, I think it is very poorly designed. And I think the reason it makes a mistake in its design is that it overemphasizes, in fact, only allows the building of new units and does not allow us to work with repair and upgradation and improvement of existing units. And that's the balance that I opened this with. And I think that precisely because of its emphasis on the construction of new units, for which you need a much larger footprint of land, for which you're going to the peri-urban areas, it is in direct conflict precisely with a lot of environmental goals of smart city planning that is ecologically sustainable. So yeah, I do think we have a housing policy that is in conflict with the SDGs. And I think for many of us who work both with the government and with communities, we have been trying to push back against this consistently. So there are two ways that I know that work best. Housing in India's federal system of governance is still a state subject, which means we put a lot of our energy to work with particular states to reintroduce other modes of housing delivery and use the central housing scheme for what it's good at. And I think the central housing scheme is good at, for example, getting finance to flow in low-income households, much better than the last scheme. I think that there is ways in which it's useful to fund the construction of some new houses. But I think as long as I would put my energy into making sure that state governments don't let their agendas be determined from Delhi. And I think this is an important thing for us to constantly say in any federal system, not just in the Indian system. And I think that we go to vote in May, and that means a new version of the mission is going to come out. And I think a lot of us who are in housing are pushing very hard at all levels, inside and outside government, to try and get this disjunct to go away for the next articulation of the mission.
Okay. We have a big question about Delhi and unauthorized housing. So we have a similar one from Brazil, though. So Luis Paulo Pinto asks that despite advances in Brazil, they have failed with housing's viability. The houses are built in marginal areas of cities and without the basic urban services. So how do they go about avoiding these mistakes?
No, I think that Brazilian urbanists really are trying to get their head around understanding why the promises of that federal law that Brazil enacted, which in English, I only know it in English, the right to the city statute, why it did not deliver some of the structural changes that it was promising. From what I understand, I would refer you, this is not my core area of expertise, but I would certainly refer you to the work of two Brazilian urbanists if you don't know them. And I think for other folks also, it's very important to read. One is a recent chapter by Edicio Fernandez, who has written about reflecting on the right to the city statute 15 years and precisely pointing out to some of the failures. And Edicio's argument is that Brazil did not go far enough, particularly in two areas. One is that it had a very promising policy to go after vacant housing and housing held for speculation that it did not fully implement. And the second is that the right to the city statute had a set of policies on regulating new real estate construction that it did not fully implement. I think what it did quite well is to at least get a first generation of upgrading, even if those are marginal locations, a first generation of upgrading the adequacy of existing informal settlements. And while not fully successful, reducing the evictions of existing informal settlements by using the zones of special social interest in some places. Now, more successful in Sao Paulo than Rio, and I think Rio particularly struggled because of the Olympics. And I think that mega events have a way of unsettling a lot of national trajectories. And I think that kind of global meta positioning really led to some sweeping reversals of what was otherwise a more progressive pathway towards inclusionary housing. The other person who I would read who thinks very differently from Edicio, and I think that's why it's important to read her, is Raquel Horniki, whose new book is called Urban Warfare, about the role of finance capital in shaping and pushing against housing inequality in different places. And I think it's as relevant to London. In fact, I know that Raquel is actually speaking about her book in London for the person who asked the question from London sometime next week. And if you can get a chance to go hear her, I think the question of financialization and urban housing is very, very relevant to both these sides. And I think that partly the big challenge in the Brazilian context has been to focus too much on upgradation and service provision and really not focus on the upper end of the housing market. And I think that's been the reason why it has, even while it progressed to raise the floor a little bit, it was not able to restructure the system. And for that, whether you're in London or Sao Paulo, you have to be able to push and draw limits and regulate the real estate housing sector. And I think that's really, there is no other way to make changes, because the informal settlement housing market is linked and competing for the same land and real estate market as the upper income housing market. And I think we see this in Indian cities right now all the time, where that balance has deeply shifted in a way that's not sustainable.
Okay. We have another question from different Luis. So Luis Fernando asks, he states that affordability is quite difficult to reach in terms of adequate standards of adequacy and viability. Is there a set of minimum acceptable conditions to solve this conflicting point?
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. I think there are two things I would suggest. One is, I think standards of adequacy need to be flexible and incremental. I think we very often use the idea of fixed norms and standards against the housing that the poor have built. And I think I'll give you a concrete example from informal settlements in India. One of the fire safety standards that we have in Indian cities is about accessibility. Every city has a version of this, is about accessibility of fire tenders. But the argument that the informal settlements made is that the logic of accessibility should be about the fire tender reaching the mouth of the settlement. Not to every house itself, because the latter required an expansion of road widths and informal settlements that was simply not possible given the densities. So they negotiated with the municipality to have a reasonable and incremental definition of access for fire tenders that fit the informal settlement and didn't compromise safety. To remember, residents of informal settlements are equally concerned about their safety. It's not that they are willing to live with any kind of hazard or risk. They have a different risk calculus in many ways. But I think what happens is that the way to get to those acceptable safety standards cannot be a one-time punitive measure against these settlements. They have to have a chance to reach those standards and be supported to reach those standards. And I think that if we think of adequacy as a set of standards incrementally reached, it gives us more room on the affordability side. So it makes that trade-off a little bit less vehement in some ways. On what affordability should mean, I think that is the other part that I don't leave you with. We use a ratio, the government in India uses a ratio that I think I find quite convincing, which is a 1:5 ratio, which is that every household is able to afford a house either through loans and finance or through payment, or through rent that is no more than 30% of monthly income. That is 5 times its annual income, which means that if you make $100 a year household income, you can afford a house that is $500 a year. And you should not be trying to buy a house that is more than that. And I think that if we start doing that, then for government policymakers, it means a realistic assessment of effective demand for housing. And that means that you actually can begin with, say, I would encourage all of you to do this exercise in your cities. Take your economic data, make a decile distribution of the income of urban households, multiply them by 5, and then say, what actually can households in my city reasonably afford to pay for? What should be affordable housing? And you will find in the Indian case that 80% of our urban households actually cannot afford houses that are more than 10 lakhs, which is our version of 1 million, 1 million rupees, and not 1 million rupees, something like that, 10 million. Sorry, we do a different metric now. I can't remember what it is. But I'll give you a counter on what it means. Our current housing policy allows the definition of affordable housing to be 3 times that amount, right? So the affordable housing policy says $300, and everything under $300 is an affordable house, even though 80% of households cannot afford more than $100. So I think there is a way in which we tend to think of affordability and put an arbitrary external figure in saying, should it be, a million, 100,000, 50,000, 10,000? What should the number be? But this affordability understood as a ratio enables you to actually think about it relative to effective demand. It's good economic rigor. And it also allows you to see the actual purchasing capacity. And this will partly answer the earlier question on what is the structure of my housing market and what is the risk of titles doing distortion of welfare instead of improvement of welfare. This kind of an affordability spectrum, we call it, can help you answer that question.
Okay, Scott Podwin is probably thinking of buying a beach cottage because he wants to know how climate change is impacting the housing markets in coastal communities, which seem to be most impacted by climate change.
We have not even begun to understand how climate change is going to change almost everything I told you earlier. The only people actually who have grappled with this properly, ironically, are the housing finance mortgage companies in America, which after a lot of disasters and floods, etc., actually are able and are creating new financial estimations of household risk, estimating climate change. So I think that there's a really interesting, and this is the emergent and cutting edge question of this work. And there's 2 aspects of it. One is how are formal housing markets, and I think for northern cities that have more developed housing finance markets, this will be the question on climate change. How will new housing finance instruments that are intergenerational, that forecast risk, how will they change the financial valuation of climate change into the way they count money? And I think this is going to be the conceptual links are very clear to me, but the practice on how climate change is going to impact housing markets will first come through the way insurers and mortgage providers and housing finance companies change the way they measure risk in response to climate. And I think that's the first place I would trace how these 2 are coming together. The second question is a different one, which is that we have been concerned in many parts of the South with what we have so far called development-induced displacement, mass displacement for large-scale modernization projects. But this category of climate-induced displacement means we are going to create a set of millions of folks that are going to have to move from their housing and therefore will effectively be internal refugees first, and then possibly cross-national refugees in certain ways. So if we see the way European urbanization is already being so deeply challenged by political refugees, I think we're not even understanding what it's going to mean when, by 2030, we may have 200 million climate displaced folks who are going to require housing, many of whom will be national citizens of the countries where they are displaced. So it won't even be a question of border crossing. But in India, this is going to be a big question vis-a-vis Bangladesh, which has a very high risk of climate impacts through water. but it's also showing up increasingly on our own coastlines, where the regularity of disaster-linked new housing construction has become one of the primary ways state policy produces housing, is post-relief and post-disaster housing. So I think it's going to change our policies. I think it's going to change the housing markets through financialization, and I think it's going to change the way we construct houses and the way we construct them. I also think that there is a particular design response on adaptation techniques in new housing building that we haven't adequately looked through, but I think that's the place where the progress will probably be the fastest.
Okay, so we have a question from Aparna Subramaniam, who does not seem to be very taken with smart cities. She asks, India seems to be constantly highlighting smart cities when the need of the hour is sustainable cities and treating housing as part of an ecosystem. So is Housing for All by 2022 looking at that at all?
No, I spoke about Housing for All by 2022 a little bit earlier as well. And I think that the design of that housing policy is actually both the smart cities mission and the Housing for All, I think, come from good intentions. But I think they are not able to battle with the most contemporary challenges of urbanization. And I think this is something that we have to think about very seriously. Because I think that in many ways, the question of if smartness is to be understood in the terms of sustainable development goals, then the primary questions of it will be about new paradigms of economic growth that forefront ecological and equity concerns as opposed to growth concerns. We do not have the option of 20th century industrial capitalism type growth rates. We just don't. Because if we continue to replicate that mode of capital investment and growth in the 21st century, then we will basically cease to exist as a species. So the problem is that our notions of understanding what smartness and good urbanization looks like are still too centered on the questions of economic growth measured in a particular way. Now, when you think about questions like slow growth or contained growth or even, which I think go much farther than ecological development. I think the questions of ecological development still think that you can hold on to preservation while growing at 6%. I think we have to push ourselves further. I think we have to really think about stepping away from growth-centered paradigms of urbanization. And any scheme, you want to call it smart or unsmart or housing or rooted, whatever you want to call it, that is able to really ask and say, if urbanization does not have the option for the kind of growth, economic growth models that underlay industrial and financial capitalism, what is the next set of economic theories that help us reimagine what growth looks like? And I don't think we have them conceptually. I don't think we have them, we certainly don't have the tools for practice. But I also don't think, even for all of us, we have yet the full political imagination to step away from our own instinctive understandings. I think if we close our eyes and imagine what good life and progress looks like, most of us still imagine exactly what modernization theorists imagined in the 20th century. I don't think we fully have understood and made this shift. So until then, every mission we make will reflect that same old growth paradigm. So we don't have a new one yet.
Okay, we have a question from Alex from Nairobi. He asks, most of the housing in my city do not meet the standards of a decent life. Why do governments fall short of delivering adequate housing for all? What are the challenges?
So I think that if you take Nairobi in a particular case, I do think that we have to appreciate, so let's appreciate the constraints of the government first. You have a housing market in which the ability and effective demand of many residents does not support a freestanding, unaided private real estate market, right? So we've talked about that earlier. It means the government must step in to either bridge gaps or construct the market in a particular way. This is a tough task for most governments because the government, if you're a government official, and I spend a lot of time with government officials, so I'm a little gentler on them than many of my comrades. I think that they are both being told to leverage public land in order to generate value and financing for infrastructure. They are being told that their cities must be competitive and compete for capital and economic growth to generate employment. And they're being told to use their same time, same resources, and same land to leverage basic public goods. Now, these two don't have to be at such odds with each other, but they're certainly distinct trade-offs. So we can't romanticize and say, let's do both. Let's do all. You can't also compete for high capital intensive. So for example, if you're Nairobi and you want to get on a global competitive chart and you want an IT park, that IT park is not going to employ a large number of folks because of the nature of IT as an industry. Right? Again, we're no longer in manufacturing-based industrial capitalism. We are in a high service, high output, but low employment financial capitalism. So therefore, balancing those modes of production really is shifting a lot of what the government has to do. Now, in this, it means that they are often reluctant to make radical interventions towards filling affordable housing gaps. So in India, when you spend money on housing, on your books, it is written off as a non-productive subsidy. But when you spend money on an interstate highway, it is put in as a capital investment from which you get investment returns. Now, this distinction that housing is seen as a revenue expenditure, a subsidy, and infrastructure and ports and roads and metros are seen as capital expenditures and therefore investments, this is where our problem lies. So part of the struggle in Nairobi as well is how do we convince, and this goes back to that question of a new growth model, how do we convince governments to take affordable housing seriously as an economic development strategy that has deep returns to the city's economy, but not similar type returns like the high output IT parks? So yeah, your GDP may not grow at 6.5%, it'll grow at 4%. But that 4% will lead to very different kinds of distributional outputs that will have very different kinds of making economically sustainable cities, if not the fastest growing cities. Unfortunately, from Nairobi to Bangalore, everyone wants to be the fastest growing city. No one's competing to have the most equitably distributed or reasonable economic development. Even the idea of reasonable economic development sounds like a cop-out. Of course, you want to grow at 7% if you can. But the point is 7% growth in this mode of production only comes from certain kinds of industry. And those industry are high output, high skill, low employment. And that's breaking and giving you that output employment mismatch is at the heart of a lot of these development debates.
We have a question about disaster rehab here. So, Kritika Kirky would like to know your take on disaster housing finance, especially for places with high propensity for disaster.
Yeah, I think disaster finance is one of those places where I think, when I was talking earlier that one of the industries that is responding very dynamically is the housing finance industry. And one of the things they've gotten very good at is doing amortization and insurance-based products that respond to disasters. I think the danger about this is that if we start thinking about disaster finance, then we financialize that responsibility, then we kind of are almost admitting that the individual consequence of disasters will map existing vulnerability structures. What I mean is, if we start looking at non-leveraged insurance-based response to disaster, then richer households who are better at being insured and getting premiums will both suffer less but also recover quicker, which means post-disaster recovery will actually not just reproduce, but worsen the inequality of inequality. Now, I think if you look at Katrina in New Orleans in the US, you have an exact example of this. In fact, the insurance landscapes were so striking that in an emergency, when public fire tenders were not coming, private fire tenders were coming on the basis of disaster insurance, putting out the fire in one house and not putting out the fire in the house next to it because only one of the two houses was insured, right? And this is, it sounds like humanely, it's unimaginable, but it is the logic of private insurance. So I think the issue about it is, if we're going to think about disaster-based insurance, my first question is, what's the leverage to distribute the risk where the ability to be insured is not a prerequisite to having support to recover from disaster? So how do we change this, into a different kind of risk pooling system that looks a lot more like universal health insurance as opposed to looking like private premium-based disaster insurance?
Hey, we'll be taking one last question for the evening, Gautam. So this is from the adjacent topic of mobility.
Yeah.
So Harsh would like to know that does worker employability or productivity mobility, any of these, depend on the type of housing, distance from work, and access to services? How do state programs addressing the distance of housing provision from areas of higher employment opportunities?
I think that in places in the world, so there's two kinds of things. One is that in many histories of planning in different parts of the world, And this is as true of, again, to take the examples we talked about today, it's as true of Nairobi and Bombay as it is of London and Sao Paulo. Employers have played a specific role in providing housing, right? And so whether it's the chawl in Bombay, the workhouses in 20th century England, so employers have always had a stake in having employees be housed well because it increases the productivity of their enterprise. Now, this link has broken in many of our cities, right? So we don't actually treat employers as very large providers of employment. Now, some of this is because a majority of employment in the global south is informal, so there are not clear employment structures to deliver them, even though contractors exist and associations exist. And I think that in many ways, this breaking of a link between housing and employability is part of the reason why that third part of our framework, which is the viability part of our framework, has broken so substantially in our cities. In India, the housing policy does not take employment into consideration at all in thinking about housing policy. And you see this in multiple ways. If you build public rehabilitation colonies in India, they're typically not mixed use, which means home-based enterprises become illegal. Small vends become illegal. The local shop selling things become illegal. Vending becomes illegal. If you think about housing that is built, in vertical housing under the Housing for All mission, there is no commercial space built into those housing designs. And the question of connection and transport doesn't even come up because our planning instruments don't connect transport planning with housing planning. Right? And I think that distinction is important. South Africa has some of the greatest challenges about this viability disjunct between spaces of residence and spaces of play. The Latin American cities do a little bit better, but partly because they've intervened quite heavily into transit systems. So in many ways, the mobility system planning becomes a critical determinant of the equity of your housing system. The stronger your public transportation system, you can mitigate some of these work. But I think that in some ways, Harsh, what I would really sort of say is what we need to be doing is we need to both bring employers back into thinking about the responsibility of housing provision, and we need to be able to have integrated planning instruments where transport modes are linked with housing locations. And then these are, as an outcome, read against distance to employment. So if you judged a city's plan by the average length of transit to work, you would make a very different plan. And I think you would have a very different housing outcome.
Okay. Thank you for that, Gautam. So this rounds up our webinar for this week. Thank you for your insights and your thoughtful answers, Gautam, to all the engaging questions that we received. If you have any further questions, please do share them at our email ID, which is cities@sdgacademy.org, and we'll get back to you with any responses. And you can find the recording of this webinar under the Module 3 Weekly tab, Webinar tab. And the date for the next webinar will be released shortly on the forum. So thank you again for your participation, and we'll see you on the webinar with Professor Michael Cohen next week.
Thank you, everyone. Take care wherever you are, and enjoy the rest of the course.
Yeah. Thank you, Gautam.
Bye.
Everyone.